Welcome to our second TransAsia-STS network seminar. The network was formed last year to promote scholarly exchanges and collaborations in the field of science and technology studies, or science, technology, and society studies, STS, across Asia, where both STS and Asia are broadly conceived. The network aspires to connect existing STS institutions, societies, and networks in South, East, and Southeast Asia, Australasia, and the Pacific, and draw in scholars and organizations working beyond these established STS infrastructures as well. We are supported by the infrastructures of the transnational STS network. I am Chinar Mehta, a doctoral candidate at the University of Hyderabad, where I'm studying web development assemblages and what that means for the web interface from a feminist perspective. Let me explain how the seminar today will work. As you know, you're watching this on YouTube. The chat box is hosted today by Karina Traits from the Science and Society Network. Please feel free to introduce yourself and use that chat to make any comments along the way. Please especially post questions for our speaker in the chat, and Karina will pass them on to me. You can post questions at any time during the talk or the Q&A. We'll have plenty of time for your questions, so please keep them coming. We'll also be over at Twitter, where we'll be live tweeting the seminar using the hashtag TransAsiaSTS. Please feel free to add your live tweets or comments to this hashtag. You can post any questions for our speaker using that hashtag, and they'll be passed on to me here. So now to introduce our speaker and discussant for today. Aihwa Ong is Professor Emerita in Anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley. She writes on contemporary forms of sovereignty, governance, cities, citizenship, bioscience, and conceptual art in the Asia Pacific. Her works on factory women, elite migrants, war refugees, neoliberal go-getters, opportunist professionals, bioscientists, and experimental artists illuminate their diverse roles in making new worlds. Ong's concepts, Chinese transnationalism, flexible citizenship, graduated sovereignty, and global assemblages have been influential in interdisciplinary fields. She is the author of several books, including Fungible Life, Experiment in the Asian City of Life in 2016. Her writings have been translated into European languages, Bahasa Indonesian, Japanese, and Chinese. Following Professor Ong's talk, Emma Koval from Deakin University will offer some discussant comments to get the conversation started. Emma Koval is a professor of anthropology and deputy director of the Alfred Deakin Institute of Citizenship and Globalization at Deakin University. She's a cultural and medical anthropologist who previously worked as a medical doctor and public health researcher. Her research interests lie at the intersection of anthropology, STS, and indigenous studies. Without any more delay, I'll hand over to Professor Ong to present her talk entitled Can Vaccine Nationalism and Vaccine Diplomacy Coexist?
Thank you for the introduction. So in this second year of the coronavirus pandemic, diverse transnational efforts have emerged to mitigate human suffering in developing countries. Now, given the wildly fluctuating conditions of COVID-19 in different parts of the world, my comments can only be tentative and provisional. I will focus on the vexed interrelationships between science nationalism and science diplomacy that play a huge role in shaping the global politics of the vaccine. I begin by addressing debates about bioscience as a state project and as a global good. Common assumptions. Sorry, I skipped pages. Common assumptions, for example, that powerful states work against global interests tend to cloud a rather mixed picture of what can be done or what has been done. Okay, next, please. Next slide. Karina, yeah. All right, science nationalism, let's think about it. We tend to think about it as a selfish form of sovereign power. The ideological accusations have been made that nation states with scientific prowess seek only to boost what I've called their bio-sovereignty by developing commercial exports of health products and capacities. And also a science development is part of national strategies to claim science in the deployment of life-saving medicine. That is, these are claims that science nationalism is a form of sequestration that is conceptually and perhaps structurally distinct from science diplomacy as an ideal of transnational virtue. Because the argument goes that science diplomacy is usually an ideal associated with the assumption that science is universal knowledge for the global good. Despite national differences, there is a belief that science is politically neutral and that scientists constitute international networks of solidarity when it comes to solving problems of global challenges. Liberal progressives and activists have proposed ideas such as humanitarianism as governance or effective altruism that can or should shape and sustain modern norms of global humanity. Proponents of humanitarianism argue that affluent countries are morally obliged to help improve living conditions everywhere, from women's rights to poverty eradication. Philosophers formulate a utilitarian theory of giving that is morally beneficial while doing the most good. Philanthropists and physicians champion the concept of global health to distribute medical care wherever it is needed. It would seem that science diplomacy then falls under such ideals of transnational virtue. The dissemination of first world science-based know-how and capacities or capabilities would tend to reduce the impact of diseases on human suffering and loss everywhere. However, it is commonly believed that science nationalism is opposed to science diplomacy. The argument goes that we may need to reduce the nationalism of science in order to safeguard the world from pestilence. But I observe it's obvious, that scientific knowledge and innovations are developed and deployed in distinct national and capitalist ecosystems, thus strengthening the technologies of what has been called immunopolitics. Political states are immunological in that they link community to immunity, exercising political exceptions of us versus them when it comes to offering bioprotections. As a global event, COVID-19 has created compelling reasons to rethink the scope of immunopolitics and the workings of biocapitalism. For instance, the delivery of life-saving doses to some countries, but not to others, creates new inequalities and exclusions, thus indirectly decreeing who can live and who can be sacrificed in the world at large. But such ranked distinctions are scientifically and ethically unsustainable, since privileged countries cannot truly claim to be fully protected from the contagion circulating in far-flung places. As well, the stop and start waves of the coronavirus have upended conventional economic activities and disrupted supply chains. But the pandemic also creates new opportunities of state support and profit-making in the new vaccine markets. But despite the rational, pragmatic, and ethical approaches for ending pandemics, vaccine diplomacies continue to make political exceptions in helping other countries. Below, I explore the complex entanglements of the biosciences as state project and as a global public good, and how they work in tandem. So I zero in on the following questions. Next slide, please. So why is science nationalism vital to the security of advanced nations? What kinds of calculus are at work for keeping or giving away biomedical know-how and resources? How do vaccine allocations shape new global disparities? Why are some countries selected for donations but not others? For recipient countries, what are the gains and risks in receiving supplies, vaccine supplies? What are the resulting inequities and other setbacks in the domestic realm? Looking at the global situation, how does vaccine diplomacy vary by donor countries? Are national or international organizations more effective in supplying vaccines to low-income countries? And why is vaccine deployment the major approach to mitigating the pandemic? Why is there no global plan? Next. So I'm going to focus on China because there's an STS in Asia, right? All right, bioscience in China. President Xi considers science and technology as the engines of China's rise. The Made in China 2025 effort targets 10 high-tech industries and from AI to biotechnology, and plans to indigenize key technologies. Technological capacities are supported by China's role in global supply chains that will help the country bring products to the world market. This is the grand strategy that frames China's version of immunopolitics. So unlike other countries, China has a grand strategy that's overarching and affects these other kinds of diplomatic activities. The need to develop a biosovereignty is challenged by the endemic deadly diseases and an aging population in this big country. As we know, South China's ecosystem has long been a breeding ground for newly emerging infectious diseases that menace the population and spill over borders to other countries. China's biotechnology is centered on fighting lethal diseases, developing customized medicines, and growing pharmaceutical industries. But many of these challenges are aspirational and they haven't yet been won. Emerging in 2002, SARS-1 was a brief warning. China rapidly expanded the field of virology and established the Wuhan Institute of Virology, a level 4 security lab that handles the world's most dangerous viruses. It claims to have discovered over 2,000 new viruses, many linked to bats in Yunnan province. The current COVID-19 outbreak of SARS-2 exposes the severity of health emergencies to come. Dr. Shi Jinling, the bat lady of the Wuhan Institute, warned that, quote, it is highly likely that future SARS or MERS-like coronavirus outbreaks will originate from bats, and there's increasing probability that this will occur in China. And she actually published that statement before the current, difficulty or quarrel over, the exact origins of the pandemic. Indeed, there are indications, perhaps the suggestions that SARS-2 may be due to biosafety lapse in the management of biological materials and the biosecurity system in the country. But given its goal of biotech autonomy, the Chinese state exerts tight control over science research, treating biomedical information as state secrets. One reason, perhaps, is that China's biopharma is not yet highly developed. Since 2015, China has imposed regulatory reforms following the FDA in drug manufacturing and clinical trial testing of new biologics in order to ease China's pharma entry into global markets. But Chinese drug companies are mainly playing the role of supplier and manufacturer and have not yet produced intellectual property. In the midst of the coronavirus, China has developed 5 vaccines, including Sinovac, which administered vaccines outside phase 3 clinical trials, giving experimental shots to hundreds of thousands of people in the fall of 2020 while trials were still underway. In other words, using ordinary people as guinea pigs outside the lab. In April 2021, Chinese physicians admitted that their vaccines aren't very good and don't have very high protection rates. This was by the director of the China Centers for Disease Control. The government is considering mixing them up to get a boost. Chinese vaccines have not been internationally approved, but supplies to other countries provide access to experiments and data points for the Chinese vaccine makers. Meanwhile, a zero infections policy backed by draconian measures has become less effective with the spread of the Delta variant. But strict containment has allowed China to buy time for a mass vaccination drive to reach 70 to 80% of the population by February 2022, ahead of the Beijing Winter Olympics. So the draconian regimen has been challenged by the Delta variant, and the economic cost of shutting down entire cities, most recently Harbin, continue to mount. Such immunopolitics, however, do not preclude the PRC from sending vaccines to a growing list of foreign countries. Next slide. In 2019, China made official the goal of providing public goods as a high-level part of its foreign policy to build the foundation of its order-building projects around the world. The BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, has already enrolled 238 countries in infrastructural projects. It is therefore not surprising that President Xi calls Chinese-made vaccines a global public good and labels its vaccine diplomacy the health Silk Road. Chinese vaccine producers use traditional methods, making the doses easier to store and distribute to tropical countries in Southeast Asia, Africa, and South America. British Consulting, a Beijing company, reports that China has delivered 260 million free doses, mostly Sinovac, to 95 countries. Since then, China has, for the most part, been selling, not donating its vaccines to other countries. Next slide. To China, Southeast Asia is the most important region of trade and strategic interest. So this table shows that Chinese donations are mainly to mainland Southeast Asian countries. In total, the PRC has also sold 190 million vaccines to the region. Next slide. For countries that are among the least vaccinated and exposed to economic downturns by the pandemic, China's deployments have been life-saving. Thus, despite doubts about the efficacy of Chinese vaccines, a Thai street vendor said she would take whatever was available. Quote, "I've nothing to lose. The economy is so bad, we are gasping for air. It's like dying while living, so just take whatever protection we can." China has left the impression that when things were tough, the Chinese stepped up. In another effort to be a champion in vaccine aid, China unlocked its intellectual property on its vaccines in order to share research and technology with big countries in the global south. Sinovac Biotech has waived its IP on CoronaVac so that Brazil and Pakistan can manufacture it for their own populations. But because Sinovac has not, as I said, not yet completed phase 3 in testing its vaccine, foreign recipients are unwittingly inducted as experimental subjects in exported Chinese vaccine trials. Recipient countries are thus recruited into the Chinese vaccine biotech system. By mid-2021, questions about the efficacy of Chinese vaccines have proliferated from Turkey to Brazil. The Sinovac efficacy rate ranged from 50 to 65%. China's rush to help low-income countries is a major plus, as rich countries initially hoarded their vaccine supplies to protect their own citizens. Thus, China can be credited with helping poor countries in their vaccine rollout and preventing severe cases. But the risks associated with its vaccines have become pronounced with a second wave Delta variant surge. Many countries are now left waiting for vaccine doses from the West that they cannot afford to buy. It is also clear that the health Silk Road, like the BRI, distributes Chinese technologies in order to enroll poor countries to their technological ecosystem. Next. Okay, so we're talking about this past year, things have changed a bit since. Vaccine diplomacies, I mean, including those enacted by India, differentiate between nations that need to be protected or not, thus engendering a global vaccine hierarchy. So we have a situation where wealthy nations produce and buy Pfizer and Moderna shots actually very early on in January 2020, and I understand in the Davos meeting of the World Economic Forum, wealthy countries came together and began to buy up Pfizer and Moderna shots. There were some countries backed off because they were too expensive. And then, at the other end, to the wealthy countries that had monopolized the good vaccines, you have poorer countries that have not even begun to immunize the majority of their populations. The third country is those countries that receive Chinese vaccines that are only partly protected. There are gradations of political inequalities in the use of vaccines as a scarce but powerful tool for local leaders. For people such as Erdogan, Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey and President Joko Widodo of Indonesia, Chinese vaccines have become a new form of political capital to be wielded according to economic or political advantage. Early on, savvy Singapore stockpiled a variety of vaccines and probably is the only country in Southeast Asia that could afford to buy the expensive Western vaccines. So Singapore stockpiled a variety of vaccines from different sources. And its leaders quietly allocated the more expensive and effective Pfizer and Moderna doses for its own citizens and expat populations, but allocated Sinovac for foreign low-skilled workers. Unlike most Southeast Asian countries, Singapore, as you've seen from the graph earlier, has attained the highest rates on inoculation of over 60 and now approaching 80%. But in its internal distribution of vaccines, its strategy reinforces the unequal distribution of health goods informed by its neoliberal calculus. More serious forms of political inequalities abetted by vaccine deployments have been reported in poorer countries exclusively dependent on Chinese supplies. Local leaders may engage in kickbacks with Chinese companies Sinopharm, Sinovac, and CanSino in the handling of vaccine supplies. Furthermore, some political leaders sequester vaccines for the use of the elite, thus creating a process that's been called line jumping. In Peru, for example, top officials received 2,000 shots from the Chinese company Sinopharm ahead of the most vulnerable, for instance, including health workers. The outraged public protested the unequal access and referred to the line jumping as vaccine gate. A third example of the use of Chinese vaccines to entrench political and health inequalities is Myanmar. In July, China promised delivery of 2 million Sinopharm doses to the border zone, partly to stem the spillover of migrants into China. But in the current disastrous situation generated by the convergence of civil war and the pandemic, the military has confiscated oxygen tanks and PPE for army use, while depriving hospitals serving COVID patients. Meanwhile, the regime is arresting hundreds of health workers for their support of the civil rights movement. In other words, vaccine supplies have become weaponized in a military's war against its own people. But in some countries, Chinese vaccine deployments have been used as political leverage over the recipient country. Next. Okay. President Duterte claimed that in the Philippines, claimed that when the pandemic first struck, he called on China's help and received 1.5 million doses in donation. But skepticism surrounding the Chinese vaccines and most hospital staff refused the jabs. Frustrated at the low rates of vaccination in his country, Duterte threatened people who refused to get inoculated with jail on an injection of an anti-parasite drug widely used to treat animals. So, that's an extreme form of extreme brutality there. In May 2021, Duterte posed for a Sino farm shot, despite his own misgivings. But soon, Chinese fishing vessels were surrounding the Kalayan Island group and Scarborough Shoal. The foreign minister of the Philippines sharply protested that the Chinese incursions were a blatant infringement of the Philippines' sovereignty. He sent a Twitter message to the Chinese, "What are you doing to our friendship? You're like an ugly oaf forcing your attentions on a handsome guy who wants to be your friend." But China's vaccine diplomacy is not the only one that comes with political conditions. As the US belatedly began to promise millions of vaccine doses, the Philippines agreed to accept J&J shots in return for restoring a defense agreement to allow the US military to use its bases in order to thwart China's growing influence in the region. Taiwan is a different kind of story. Next. In June 2021, Taiwan confronts the first vaccine outbreak in lockdown. Less than 5% were vaccinated thus far. But a major reason was Taiwan was blocked from getting the Pfizer vaccine made by biotech because of its agreement with the Fosun Pharma of Shanghai, the distributor for the Chinese mainland, Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. China exerted pressure against Taiwan's use of the word country in its deal with biotech, forcing Taiwan's compliance. Furthermore, China accused Taiwan of playing politics by refusing to accept Chinese-made vaccines. A May survey found that 3/4 of Taiwan's respondents said that they wouldn't take a Chinese vaccine. So instead of waiting to get the Pfizer that's been blocked, two Taiwan companies, Foxconn and TSM chipmaker, purchased the Pfizer shots and donated them to the Taiwan government. By late August 2021, Taiwan's President Tsai received the first shot of the locally developed coronavirus mitigating vaccine, thus rushing its approval before the results of the clinical trials were available. Ironically, Taiwan's quest for strategic autonomy in vaccine development and availability echoes China's vaccine policies. But it is clear that China's vaccine strategy goes beyond just economic interests. It has become a geopolitical question. Vietnam. Next. Like the Philippines, Vietnam has had to juggle Chinese vessels in sovereign waters with the receipt of Sinopharm doses. In the US, giant apparel makers had urged the US government to speed up vaccine aid to Vietnam to help end the shutdown of factories. So on her visit this August, Vice President Harris promised a gift of 1 million doses of Pfizer vaccine. But as arrival to Vietnam was delayed, her pledge was upstaged by the China's promise of 2 million Chinese vaccine doses. So Vietnam has become the most explicit example of being a pawn in the vaccine upmanship between the big rival donors. Next. By July 2021, Sinovac recipient countries, Mongolia, the Seychelles, Cambodia, the Philippines, and Indonesia, found themselves battling huge surges in infection in the midst of corona variants. Indonesia is the biggest buyer of Sinovac vaccine, but not enough to cover its 275 million people. The country suffered the highest resurgence of infections, with 10% of its health workers becoming infected. Many Indonesians are dying outside the overloaded hospital system without the formal identification as COVID patients. And I suspect that's the same situation in other countries. Indonesia may have suffered the most risk from the Delta variant that neutralizes Chinese vaccines. So here, this is a picture of the funeral of dozens of health workers who were killed who died despite having received Sinovac doses. So next, I will talk about the different styles of vaccine diplomacy. See how vaccine diplomacies are shaped by shifting goals and circumstances, and then the different national agendas and pacing of vaccine aid. So China's vaccine diplomacy has intended to change its international image from being the source of the coronavirus to be a leader in global health. Vaccine diplomacy is tied to exercising its political clout in the southern peripheries. But the Health Silk Road also buys experiments and time to grow China's vaccine autonomy. To prevent disrupting homegrown shots and to fully vaccinate its 1.1 billion people by October's end, the PRC has been very slow in approving foreign vaccines. Meanwhile, it's pushing public efforts to develop China's own mRNA shots. By comparison, India is also perhaps not that different in some aspects. India proposes a kind of vaccine friendship that competes with China in seeking international goodwill and recognition, like competing to provide vaccine donations to places like Nepal. India, of course, has extreme vaccine prowess. It produces 60% of the world's doses, but then that stems from collaborating with the West through the WHO-supported organization Covax. The Serum Institute, with US funding, has made AstraZeneca and exported 66 million doses to 72 countries before April 2021, when the country sought to inoculate its own population during a major COVID resurgence. Indian pharmaceutical companies, SII, Bharat Biotech International, and Biological E have since resumed production and promised they will soon export vaccine doses to developing countries. But desiring to be bigger global players, India and South Africa both want the waiver of TRIPS, or trade-related intellectual property rights, and for Western companies to share expertise in setting up and running vaccine factories in their own countries. But they do face obstacles stemming from national and corporate interests in the West. The United States is the world's biggest maker and hoarder of effective vaccines. So last year, under Operation Warp Speed, Moderna and Pfizer benefited from the NIH mRNA technology and massive US government funding. Moderna, for instance, received $2.5 billion from American taxpayers. So this is a triumph of rapid vaccine development, although the US has lost over 600 million lives to COVID, more than any other country, officially anyway, in the world. In June 2021, after reaching 50% domestic vaccination rate, President Biden promised to donate 600 million doses to the global south through Covax. By September, the low efficacy of Sinovac shots against the Delta variant has countries turning to the United States as a go-to global supplier of vaccines when they become more readily available. Brazil, for instance, is limiting Chinese shots and administering Pfizer jabs and making AstraZeneca doses. So my points are that vaccine diplomacy is made possible by the development of science nationalism. National rivalry prompts countries to develop, innovate, manufacture, and distribute vaccines safely. There's also, when we look at the vaccine diplomacy, there's interesting differences in timing. China and India are among the first in line to offer help overseas, but the risk of low efficacy and cutbacks have disrupted the supply lines. The US and EU countries tend to have attended first to domestic needs before starting to deal with the needs of the world at large. Next slide. Yeah, so this is a picture of the resurgence in India. So the current situation is that we see that there's a big overlap of science nationalism and biocapitalism that prevents the realization of what one could consider as true science diplomacy as happening on the world stage. What in fact we have is the renationalization of human life. Access to life-saving medicine depends more on where you are or your citizenship than anything else. But of course, if you're wealthy, you can fly to the United States and get free vaccines, no questions asked. And meanwhile, in the United States, we're considering getting third booster jabs when most of the world lacks access to even one shot. So, the WHO has called for a moratorium on booster shots in the first world country until vaccines are more equitably distributed. Meanwhile, the UN-led Covax falls short in delivering vaccines to poor countries. Not even 10% of the population in poor countries, that is less than 4% of Africa's population, is fully vaccinated. Meanwhile, China, as the incoming chair of BRIC, I'm surprised that BRIC still exists, that is Brazil, Russia, India, and China, plans to, as the incoming chair, China plans to form an alternative BRIC network that will improve vaccination delivery and diversify pharma and vaccine production capacities in the global south. But when it comes to sharing information, the PRC has obstructed data on the origins of the coronavirus by destroying early virus samples and forbidding the release of raw data to WHO investigators. So not only have countries disrupted full science diplomacy, big pharma too has been resistant to an intellectual property waiver because they mainly American, but European too, drug companies claim that a waiver will not facilitate the ramping up of vaccine supply. There are problems of access to raw materials like test tubes and other resources, problems with ground distribution, technological transfers, global manufacturing networks, in order that can help quickly address the supply issues. So these limits on full scientific diplomacy, cooperation, and coordination have produced a picture, in fact, a situation of grotesque vaccine divide. Currently, 60 to 80% of US and European populations have been vaccinated. Only 4% of the world's supply have been sent to low-income countries, less than 1% to African nations. Chinese and US vaccination rates approach 55 to 60% of their respective populations. In California, we've administered almost as many doses, 43 million, as all of Africa, which has received 49 million. And meanwhile, of course, the very uneven distribution of vaccines have caused extreme economic costs, driving 31 million people into poverty. Next slide. So, from a global health perspective, widespread immunity is the only way to get through a pandemic and restart the world economy. Since variants are caused by the ongoing pandemic of the global unvaccinated, it would be rational, practical, and ethical for countries to come together and plan a single strategy. So the UN has called for a coordinated global vaccine plan in which doses will be distributed equitably around the world. The chief scientists at WHO, Dr. Swaminathan, urged countries to share their supplies. She said, a country-by-country approach, a nationalist approach is not going to help us out of this pandemic. And that's where we are today. So the question is, what would be the steps towards a global plan of what one could call radical altruism? I mean, by radical altruism, I'm actually signaling Peter Singer's idea of effective altruism, which is based on utilitarian reasons. You get the most bang for your buck. So I'm going to mention a few steps. The US has outlined recently, like this week, President Biden at the United Nations has outlined a plan to vaccinate the world by 2022, to deliver 1.1 billion doses by next year. He calls the United States, now that most of the countries taken care of, an arsenal of vaccines, and claims a no strings attached approach. And it's committed to donate and not sell effective doses to low-income countries. It plans to scale up production in Quad nations and mobilize other Western countries to help poorer nations stymied by weak public health services and delivery systems. The second promising step, or perhaps step in the right direction, is growing international pressure on G7 and EU countries to support the waiver of intellectual property rights to vaccine production. Countries like Indonesia call for the diversification of production centers across the world. NGOs like Doctors Without Borders plan to teach vaccine manufacturing in the global south to supply the needs there. But the big pharma is proposing its own alternative strategy. Drug companies claim that the mRNA process is very complex and that low-income countries lack capabilities to manufacture vaccines safely and to uphold safety standards. Meanwhile, international critics have accused Pfizer, BioNTech in Germany and AstraZeneca in England of putting potential profits ahead of beating back the pandemic. Pfizer, for instance, in the United States, Pfizer is paid $7 a dose by the US government, but is said to be limiting supplies now in order to charge $175 per dose on the global market. But drug companies are insistent that signing over intellectual property is not just handling over the mRNA recipe, but it also involves a technological transfer that will hollow out the biotech base and undermine incentives for the companies to invest in new technologies. They also want to keep their competitive advantage vis-a-vis other drug companies in the world to potentially develop other mRNA vaccines for cancer, HIV, and malaria. Moderna, though, had signaled that it may license its intellectual property for COVID vaccines after the pandemic ends. For now, drug companies prefer to sell doses at non-profit prices to the US government to donate to the rest of the world through Covax. Maybe another final promising step would be big philanthropies coming in, joining NGOs to come together to coordinate vaccine aid. Gates Foundation has proposed a global plan of pandemic preparedness, the ability to make a vaccine in 100 days and manufacture enough for the entire world in the following 100 days. Gates is prepared to help fund vaccine making hubs around the world. So the final point that I want to make is that we do need while multilateral agencies, governments, foundations, NGOs are beginning to cooperate and coordinate efforts, can we expect to materialize new forms of science humanitarianism? But we need, I think, an ideological effort to align the goals or the visions of China and the United States, the global rivals, who are working at odds in helping to bring the pandemic to an end. An argument could be made for science-based effective utilitarianism that is morally profitable while doing the most good, or morally beneficial while doing the most good. We need a new narrative that integrates Western ideals, the Western ideal of common humanity, with China's socialist focus on common prosperity, in a unified vision that can mitigate somewhat the rhetoric of big powers competition. So instead of nationalist discourse on vaccine availability, a global narrative of common humanity would help us rethink immunopolitics beyond the nation state and better prepare to confront a shared future of accelerating global emergencies. Oh. That's the end.
Thank you, Professor Ron. I'd like to invite Professor Emma Koval to if she has any comments.
Thank you, Aihwa. That was such a beautiful talk, and amazing to see all of the region encompassed in 40 minutes. I wanted to make some comments, partly to reflect your argument back to you to see whether that I've got it right, and whether we can dig a little deeper on a couple of points. So biocapitalism is obviously in charge here in terms of the vast majority of these vaccines are for profit, and big pharma is obviously a massive beneficiary, along with Zoom and other platforms that have really flourished in these pandemic times. But yeah, I really appreciated your passing out of vaccine nationalism and then vaccine diplomacy as a kind of subset of that. I wanted to ask about vaccine sovereignty as potentially another kind of vaccine nationalism. And you mentioned the Taiwanese attempts at vaccine sovereignty that have somewhat backfired. And I know that there was Japan in the end. They accepted a bunch of vaccines from Japan, and that I think was another interesting step in regional geopolitics. But here in Australia, we've also had a fairly unsuccessful experiment with vaccine sovereignty, which for us was the AstraZeneca vaccine, which we made locally. But when the very rare side effect of around 1 in a million deaths, 1 in a million doses on average causing death from a rare blood clotting condition, we've had dropping demand, and we have been then doing our own mini diplomacy in trying to send our AstraZeneca doses to the Pacific, which is another aspect of the region where China has done some very successful vaccine diplomacy. So yeah, I wanted to kind of see where you think vaccine sovereignty fits into all this. And then I just wanted to mention kind of 3 biosocial features which seem to have thrown all sorts of spanners in the works of both vaccine nationalism and biocapitalism. And the first is obviously the evolution of the virus itself. So you mentioned that Sinovac has a low efficacy in preventing infection and preventing severe disease and preventing spread. But yeah, most of the vaccines have a decreased efficacy with the Delta variant, and who knows what's coming afterwards. So the evolution of the virus itself is challenging this kind of dichotomous understanding that we probably all had, hopefully last year, that we're not vaccinated, we will get vaccinated, and that kind of dichotomous vaccinated, not vaccinated, almost analogous to the kind of conventional idea of immunity as self and non-self, as a relationship between self and non-self. But of course, we have a massive variability in vaccine response between individual bodies, but we have waning immunity, which is the problem you raised in Indonesia. It's happening in many countries. And this whole new temporality of immunity that we're all going to have to learn to live with booster shots. So, and then the third, along with the evolution of the virus and the variability in immunity, is the iatrogenesis, is the side effects from the vaccination, which can have very rare, but can have really disproportionate effects politically. And then flow-on effects for vaccine diplomacy, as we see in Australia and the Pacific. So I just also just the kind of other point I wanted to make, reflecting on your comments on different kinds of vaccines, that as well as the vaccine hierarchy that you kind of outlined, which absolutely we have, that Pfizer is better, that we kind of get a vaccine aesthetics, even though they're all like in the same little vials. I think there is in popular culture a really strong aesthetic in terms of what kind of vaccine you get, and partly that's related to the origin and the mechanism, but also the way that it's stratified for the population. So in Australia, older people get AstraZeneca, so if you can get Pfizer, that shows that you're below a certain age. So yeah, I wanted to kind of see what you thought about the various interpretations I've put there. And then just finally, I wanted to ask what has surprised you, because of course, all this vaccine nationalism is politics by other means, and we see the so fairly predictable flows of China using vaccines to further its interest in Southeast Asia. You see the US being pretty selfish, but now with a lot of vaccine on board, or having nearly exhausted the number of people who are willing to get a vaccine, are now turning to the potential for vaccine diplomacy to extend their interest. But is there anything that has surprised you? So I will leave it there. And please, everyone, do put your questions in the YouTube chat or on Twitter, and we will ask Aihwa after this.
Well, I guess I can say that vaccine autonomy is a subset of biosovereignty. I mean, it is, because China wants to be technologically autonomous. I mean, it wants, in fact, to be the leader of in all technological fields, the global leader, and of that, the health sciences is very, very important. It does seem like, in some ways, for poor countries, a waste of resources to try to achieve vaccine autonomy, since the US it has the resources and is quite capable of producing pretty good vaccines to supply the world, right? So it's, but obviously, when you're like Taiwan, then, and China blocks your access to global supply chains, then you might want to sort of come up with your own vaccines. And it's a source of national pride to have the capacity to do that. But it's not something that many countries can hope to achieve. The political implications of to vaccinate or not to vaccinate, to be vaccinated or not to be vaccinated. I can get into it. It's so crazy in the United States. The politics are so ridiculous and disastrous. In the United States, I mean, we have lost close to 700 million, close to 700,000 people. It's a terrible waste. Many of them are old people, are the aged, and increasingly children are becoming vulnerable to infection. But my sense is that there is, in the United States, I mean, this may be incorrect in the long run, but the vaccine makers are pretty confident that the pandemic will end and that vaccines will work, despite bad effects that many people are worried about. So we'll see what happens. The pharmaceutical companies are very, very protective of their technology, as you can see. They are afraid that China is going to catch up very quick, and I think China will quickly figure out how to produce their own mRNA vaccines. So it's going to be a kind of big power competition in the realm of cutting edge life-saving medicine. That's the world. So the binarism comes back in that geopolitical form. The interesting thing about China is that I don't know how much longer, maybe Australia too, they can have a zero infection policy. It's very draconian. It's very costly. It's, so different small countries like Singapore and Malaysia, maybe Australia. I mean, Australia not a small country, but other countries are thinking of sort of living with the pandemic. With COVID, treated like influenza, just another infectious disease you have to be vaccinated against every year. I'm not sure, I didn't quite understand your question about the aesthetics of different vaccines. I mean, there's the Pfizer versus the Moderna people, but it's not very strong in California. I mean, we're very vaccinated and people just act in a kind of responsible public health kind of way. I don't think there's a lot of, competition around that about which is the better one, although Moderna is supposed to be more effective for a longer time. I'm actually surprised that the United States stepped up. So that's what's surprising. I'm surprised that Biden has decided he's going to make this, try to spearhead a global plan to vaccinate the world. And now that India is recovering from its resurgence, is able to begin production again, and maybe there will be some transfer of technology to companies in South Africa. Maybe these two external sources will be producing the vaccines needed for different regions of the world. But clearly it needs, what's needed is to go beyond the nation state taking the lead. We need a kind of international multilateral network, maybe many networks, not one, but many different kinds of networks. And it's great that Bill Gates is stepping up and thinking about preparedness, because this is not going to be the only pandemic. There's going to be future pandemics, and they're coming up very fast. And so we need to start preparing, not just through the distribution of multiple manufacturing hubs, but also just to speed up the production of effective vaccines. Maybe we can take some questions.
Yeah, so we have some interesting questions from YouTube. So the first question is from Professor Usha Raman. She asks, would immunopolitics, the concept of immunopolitics, also apply to marking communities who are seen as particularly vulnerable or identified or scapegoated as super spreaders?
I mean, immunopolitics is just a concept that kind of is an extension of biopolitics. Biopolitics mean a politics that's a focus on the biological well-being and protection. And Foucault didn't mention the community. So when we say immunopolitics, we're basically saying, okay, but then the community, how do you define the community? India is the community versus, I don't know, Australia. China is the national community versus the rest of the world. So when we talk about nationalism, there's the sense of in the first instance, to sort of enforce immunological policies and measures to safeguard the national body, right? First. And increasingly, we live in a world where, in fact, you can't do that because you are not really protected from the pandemic if it's still circulating in Africa and, I don't know, everywhere, Latin America, huge hidden circulations of COVID, of MERS, of Ebola. I mean, these things are still flowing around, but they're not as virulent as the coronavirus. We're still not fully protected, so we are compelled to act on a global scale beyond the nation state. So my idea is just to sort of rethink immunopolitics to the global level, beyond the nation state, to the global level.
Okay. There are two questions about WHO's role in the entire thing. So one question, I'll ask them together. One question is from Ashish Gosain, who asks, what are the structural constraints faced by WHO's Covax program in ensuring distributive access to the vaccine in less developed countries? And a bit more broadly, there's another question from Professor Usha Raman. She asks, what realistically is the role of the WHO in mediating the effects of vaccine nationalism or diplomacy?
I can't answer those questions, because I don't know. But basically, the WHO hasn't been very effective. Maybe it's better as a kind of symbolic conscience of the world. It's there to kind of, to persuade China to share its data, to kind of track down the origins of the virus, to get the world to work together when they're actually competing with one another. But Covax seems promising, and not just Covax. Biden, of course, is trying to work through the Quad. So you have these kinds of multilateral agencies, or rather, blocks. You have blocks. You have Covax for distributing vaccine, produced with US funding in India for the rest of the world. You have the Quad, which is Japan, India, US, and Australia coming together to coordinate some other aspects of vaccine production, maybe, and distribution. And China wants to lead to head a BRIC bloc to do that will really counter the North Atlantic Anglo-Saxon, maybe, assemblage there. So I mean, we are on the brink of catastrophe. I mean, the WHO chief just said that. So it's to sort of rally the world and to point to the dangers that we are in. In the case of Covax, that's been very clear. It's because when the Indian drug companies began to supply India, they couldn't at the same time export vaccine doses to the rest of the world. And that was a major disruption. And it's not India's fault. It's just that the US companies are too expensive. You know, their doses, they're producing doses that cost a lot of money that many countries cannot afford to buy. So you need the US government to intervene and say, we're going to compel Pfizer and Moderna to sell us rather cheaply their doses so that we can donate them to the rest of the world. Some people have said in today's New York Times that the Defense Production Act, that Biden could invoke the Defense Production Act to declare the pandemic a national security threat, thereby compelling the American companies to share their technologies with other countries. So that would be an instance where national security now blends into global security or insecurity, and then requires international attention.
Okay, thank you. There's another question from Casimir McGregor. In the West, vaccine hesitancy has been stoked by the media, especially TikTok. How do you think authoritarian media control in countries like China has helped or hindered the uptake of vaccines?
I don't know. I don't watch TikTok. I have no idea what social media does. Well, I mean, in China, they closed down social media that report a lot of unhappiness with the very, very strict lockdowns. A lot of people suffered in the early days of the kind of massive citywide lockdowns. But so the Chinese government has squashed all those reports. I think the role of social media is kind of interesting because it's a kind of vaccine public, I guess. It's a space of resistance, rebellion, activism that could be supplementary, perhaps, in making sure that I mean, in California, people are very embarrassed by the idea of taking booster shots. I mean, many people I know don't want the booster shots that's recommended for people over 65. I mean, obviously, we always fall back on this individualistic position that, well, you know, everyone makes his or her own decision. But many Americans of the liberal persuasion seem to think that we should distribute these booster shots to the rest of the world and not use them ourselves. Although Biden says that our booster shots, you know, are not in the same pot as the vaccines that we would donate. And I don't know how long, I don't know their lifetime, you know, quality, whether in fact you can transport American booster shots to the developing countries. There's a lot of problems in low-income countries with delivery, transportation, logistics, and a number of health workers who know how to administer the shots. So we need a lot of help there. And apparently China is offering money. So the other thing, the other form of aid is not just in the form of vaccines, but in the form of cash, so that the local government can begin to, you know, ramp up these other kinds of services to make sure that the vaccines get into people's arms and they're not just festering in the airports, you know.
Yeah, so there's a question from Gargi Mahasi. Terms like vaccine diplomacy and vaccine nationalism seem to be rooted in the language of global health. Are they also dominating political global health? The terms vaccine diplomacy and vaccine nationalism seem to be rooted in the language of global health. Are they also dominating political and academic discourses conducted in Chinese, or are there other ways of framing these issues in China? So, for example, in Japan, it is much more a matter of public health politics than anything else. Are there any other ways of framing these issues in China is the question.
Well, China calls it the health Silk Road. So, I mean, science diplomacy is just a concept that science is disinterested global know-how that's valuable to all humankind, and that scientists kind of naturally form networks that cut across international borders in the interest of using science for the global good. So different countries may couch it in different ways. In China's case, there's this kind of tight connection to the idea of the Belt and Road Initiative. That this is yet another example of China putting its massive resources and expertise, into play to help poorer countries. So it's an extension of its foreign policy. I don't know that they will use the word science diplomacy. I'm sorry, you mentioned Japan. I barely know what's going on in Japan other than the Tokyo Olympics.
So since you mentioned, Professor Ong, that scientists collaborate across borders,
We should. We ought to, yes.
Yeah, I have a question that so does this sort of vaccine diplomacy or vaccine nationalism in scientific collaboration, in what way do you think it might appear? Is it as say normal as any scientist from anywhere will collaborate with anyone, or is it
it would be desirable? It's an ideal, right? So we're talking about an ideal situation of training each other's students in cutting edge fields, even though they may go home and set up rival companies, or coming together in a time of an emergency like this one. I remember during the tsunami, in the aftermath of the tsunami, Chinese companies actually helped to identify bodies and provided all kinds of other aid. So there's a kind of implicit activist component in the best of sciences, because it is viewed as a global good. It shouldn't be limited know-how and capabilities sequestered in particular in rich countries only. All the conferences and traveling around, scientists are constantly doing projects together, sharing information on diseases and new therapies, making new discoveries. In Singapore, in my book on Singapore, Singaporean scientists were helping neighboring countries like Laos and Thailand to engage in field studies to track viruses, the emergence of viruses, in other words, teaching a variety of skills to your neighborhood, because after all, you're going to be affected, right? If you don't care about your neighbors, then you're not really protected.
Right, true. There's another question. How do you think your concept of vaccine humanitarianism relates to Mark Davis and the colleagues' concept of immunocosmopolitanism, understanding immunity as a relationship rather than a state?
It is a relationship. I didn't say it was a state. It's a relationship between a country, a community, and immunity. Maybe his term sounds better, but I'm afraid I haven't heard it, so I'm sorry. Probably we're talking about the same thing.
Okay, right. I think these were all the questions that we have. Just a second. Yeah, these were all the questions that we have. Thanks, everyone, for participating in this engaging discussion. And thanks to the Deakin Science and Society Network for hosting this event. Thank you, Professor Ong, for taking the time to chat with us. To stay up to date, you can subscribe to the TransAsiaSTS Google group. Karina will put that link in the YouTube chat for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shina and Emma. Thank you for hosting me, inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you, Aihwa. That was wonderful.
Thank you.